Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. President Clinton is about up to here in scandal, but he is hardly the first president to be in that situation. Some survived their scandals with their reputations intact. Some didn't. How will history judge President Clinton? Joining us for what we expect to be a pornography-free discussion of President Clinton are Michael Barone, author of Our Country, editor of the Almanac of American Politics and a senior staff editor of the Reader's Digest, and William Galston, professor of public policy at the University of Maryland, a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and former deputy assistant for domestic policy for President Clinton. The topic before the House, Clinton's legacy, this week on Think Tank. By all accounts, President Clinton is a student of past presidents and how history has regarded them. Here are some presidents he might want to study further. Andrew Jackson defended the loose morals of the wife of his Secretary of War, that was Peggy Eaton, and in the resulting scandal, he forced his entire cabinet to resign. He was also censured by the Congress over his handling of a banking crisis. Today, his face is on the $20 bill, and Democrats hold fundraising dinners in his honor. Ulysses Grant, though a hero of the Civil War, was dogged by financial scandals during his second term as president. The historical judgment, great general, bad president. President Warren Harding died in office just before his Attorney General and Secretary of the Interior were indicted for corruption. Judgment, bad president. Richard Nixon, lashed by the Watergate scandal, was the first president in American history forced to resign.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
But he had some major international triumphs. Judgment, mixed. Ronald Reagan, during his second term, was embroiled in what was known as the Iran-Contra scandal. Reagan's rating, for the moment, good, getting better.
General Secretary Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
What will happen to Bill Clinton? His defenders point to the job that he has done in office on the economy, welfare, crime, and the environment. His detractors don't like him or his policies. Scandal or accomplishment? Which will win? Which should win? Welcome, Bill Galston. Michael Barone to Think Tank. Michael Barone, why don't you give us a little historical background? I mean, how did Andrew Jackson end up? He had these scandals. We saw it on the setup piece, and he's on the $20 bill, and every February they have Jefferson Jackson Day dinners.
Well, part of the reason for that was the censure which the Senate voted on him was really a difference over public policy, whether or not the federal government should withdraw its deposits from National Bank, the Second National Bank of the United States. And so that was, the question is, over time, Jackson became a sort of symbol of a frontiersman, Battle of New Orleans, a president, and so forth. He instituted the practice that was followed up till the turn of the century or after of throwing out all the old government officials, putting all the new ones in. So I think in that sense, that was a different, quote, scandal situation.
What about Ulysses Grant?
Well, I think what you can see in the case of both Ulysses Grant and Warren G. Harding, who are often set up as our most scandal-plagued presidents, in fact, significant accomplishments or public policies that they backed got obscured by the charges of scandal, which I think in Grant's case were mostly, as a friend of mine, Frank Scaturo's book, President Grant Reconsidered, argues, most of those scandals weren't about Grant. They happened before he came in, or else he stopped them and foiled them and so forth. His reputation. What he did was he restored the full value of the currency by withdrawing greenbacks and getting a resumption of solid money, which went ahead after and finished up after his term. And he was also the only president between Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, I think you can argue, who made a serious attempt for equality for black Americans in the South in the Reconstruction policy. The policy failed, but Grant tried manfully to do it and did it. Harding 1920s. Harding, the country was in economic shambles when he came in. He came back with a major tax cut, which made a significant difference. He got rid of the Red Scare. He pardoned Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate for president who had been jailed by Democratic President Woodrow Wilson. He negotiated the Washington Naval Treaty, something one friend of mine called the only successful disarmament treaty ever negotiated.
And we ended up with World War after that.
Well, I think Harding died in
Detail.
1923. I think Harding died in 1923 to blame the World War on the Washington Naval Treaty
right.
or on Harding.
No,
Well, I don't think it
I
flows
understand,
directly from
right.
the Washington Naval Treaty.
Okay.
That was a record of substantial policy accomplishment, whether you
Right.
agree that the policies are good or bad, that made a significant difference, arguably a good difference, and yet all we remember about Harding typically is Teapot Dome and the affairs apparently he was carrying on with women other than his wife.
And what about Richard Nixon, just to put an exclamation point on all of this?
Well, Richard Nixon de-escalated and withdrew American forces from the Vietnam War. He increased the size of the government. He invented EPA, OSHA, racial quotas and preferences came into office under President Nixon. He
Opened the door to China.
Wage and price controls. I mean, there were major substantial policies. In many ways, Richard Nixon was our most left-wing president to date on many domestic policies and on de-escalating the Vietnam War.
And how is he remembered? Scandal or policy?
I think it's a mixture in President Nixon's case. The China thing is still remembered. It's not remembered as well with all the left-wing initiatives that he did on domestic policy because it's inconvenient for both Democrats and Republicans to think of Nixon that way. But Watergate is also a major component of it.
Okay. Bill Galston, you were one of the formative spirits of the Democratic Leadership Council, which attempted to rescue our party from falling off the left side of the world. You worked with President Clinton in the White House for how many years?
2.5.
For 2.5 years on domestic policy, principally education. You kept your oar in on all of these issues. If the Clinton presidency terminated today, what would his legacy be?
Well,
and what are the accomplishments?
First of all, let me just say, the term legacy is ambiguous because one interpretation is what a person has actually done. A second interpretation is what he is remembered for at a particular moment in time. And artists and musicians, if you go back hundreds of years, their reputations fluctuate wildly based on the same record of accomplishment but different standards of evaluation. So I think we have to be careful. If you're asking what has actually been accomplished, I think the answer is very substantial things. We were talking about $300 billion budget deficits as far as the eye can see when Bill Clinton took office. We're not talking about that anymore. We had a welfare system that was broken, and the president, working with the Republican Congress, redeemed the pledge to end welfare as we now know it. The president has substantially reoriented the Democratic Party and the country on issues of criminal justice. And I would add, the president took an obscure educational experiment, namely charter schools, and has made it, or helped to make it, a national movement by putting the federal government on the side of states that want to go in that direction.
And just to show my complete objectivity on this matter, and in many ways I think I am objective, I mean, he did things in the arena of foreign trade that I doubt that a Republican president could have done. NAFTA and GATT, I mean, these were monumental achievements for the international economy.
Yeah, well, you asked me about domestic policy,
Right.
but if I were to go on to talk about international affairs and poach a little bit, NAFTA, GATT, making the global economy a central theme of American foreign policy in the post-war world and making it impossible to evade that issue, and I would argue forthrightly declaring his support for NATO expansion and making that happen, which I think is a very significant structural accomplishment which hasn't played out yet because there's more to come in that front.
Okay, Michael, you've just heard a recent White House aide and an older White House aide give a typical White House explanation of how the world works. Everything good flows from the White House and from the president. You buy what he said?
Well, I think very many good things flow from Bill Galston.
Right, now we stipulate that.
Well, I think
But
Bill Clinton's...
he gives him sort of a low A plus
Well,
as a president.
I see it somewhat differently, Ben. I think that this president has been less important on the domestic front than many other presidents have been, and that's not entirely his own fault. That would be true, I think, of any president, left, right, or center at this stage in our history, because I think we are becoming in many ways a more decentralized country. As we move away from the experience of total war, of Cold War, as we move away from the idea that an ever larger state is a good idea,
but
local
what is
initiatives,
more-
I mean, Bill made several good points here about, I would say that in many ways, Mr. Clinton has been an interested and occasionally helpful spectator of processes that have been initiated
Well,
otherwise.
now,
And where he has
hold
been
on,
helpful,
hold on.
Bill Galston played a leading
Now,
role
wait.
in being helpful by signing the
Michael,
welfare
Michael,
bill. But the
you-
initiative came from governors in many respects.
but
The
Michael-
crime stopping, Clinton spotlighted it, provided some money. Initiative came from mayors to a very considerable
Michael,
extent.
you know the rules of the road in this town as well as anybody. If a man runs for president and says, I'm going to end welfare as we know it, and he gets elected and he says, I'm going to end welfare as we know it, and he keeps saying we're going to end welfare as we know it, and then 4 years later you end welfare as we know it. Now, there are a lot of intervening events, and the Republicans...
Well, and
the
Senator Moynihan said if the welfare bill had come 14 weeks after the election instead of 14 weeks before, he would have vetoed it. Whatever.
But the rules of the road are the man set a new rhetorical standard, and those of us who are speechwriters believe that rhetoric creates reality. And in fact, a series of events occurred where there's been in my judgment at least, a major and beneficial change on welfare. So why do you say he's merely a bystander to these events?
Well, I said an interested spectator and occasionally helpful, and I think he has been occasionally helpful on that. And I think that we're in a different period of history from when we were when Franklin Roosevelt confronted this huge economic emergency, and then we had total war in World War II, Cold War. We got the idea that the president runs the country. You hear that phrase. It's a ridiculous phrase in many ways, and I don't think you have to be speaking in derogation of President Clinton to say that. It's a ridiculous phrase because this is a great and wonderful country that in these happy and peaceful times, to a very considerable extent, through public as well as private sector, runs itself in lots of different ways. Now, obviously, a president still has some importance. He can claim the welfare reform, though very much of the initiative came from Republican Congress, Republican and Democratic governors around the country, a variety of people, of intellectuals and so forth. Mr. Clinton was one part of that process, a helpful part of that process, I believe. But this whole idea that the president runs everything.
Feel free to interrupt if you...
I enjoy listening to him so much.
listening.
It's very hard.
Right.
But I both agree and disagree with what Michael had just said. I agree with the proposition that as compared to the depth of the Depression or the height of the Cold War, the centralizing forces in American politics are weaker than they were. And decentralization is going to play itself out.
When President Clinton takes credit for the wonderful economy, now you're a pretty smart, educated man and have some sense of how the economy works, and granted every president does it. Do you say, oh, I mean, I can't believe that any man would claim credit for a sterling economy in a country of almost 300 million people with a gross national product of $8 trillion and, you know, Alan Greenspan and free market forces and Paul Volcker, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or you think that's just Clinton?
Look, the federal government helps to create the framework and the rules within which all of these important market decisions get played out. And it makes a difference whether the market thinks long-term interest rates are going up or going down. The fundamental point that Bob Rubin made during the presidential transition in 1992 was that the president had it in his power to choose an economic policy that would put the foundations of the market on a steady and a sustainable course for years to come. And the president, listening to conflicting advice, decided to embrace that policy. He fought hard for a budget that was controversial within his own party and in the Congress, obviously, between the parties. He prevailed by the narrowest of margins, and I think the consensus of economists is that that decision created the foundation for the prosperity that we're now enjoying.
You thought at the time that budget was a turkey.
I thought that budget would impede economic growth. It did not impede it as much as I thought. You could still argue that it had some marginal negative effect as well. I mean, as I see the macroeconomy, the largest part of the growth in GDP, lowering of interest rates, lowering and reduction to zero and below of the budget deficit has occurred after the November 1994 election. President Clinton as president, the Republican Congress in there, the inner and often bitter interaction between those two has seemed to produce a very fine result, and you see the public and opinion polls at the moment giving the president and the Congress
All right,
good job
I
ratings.
want to come back to just that in just 1 minute. Let me just ask you very briefly what you think of this scandal. Did you feel betrayed when you saw the Starr report?
I felt sad. Sad for the president, sad for the country. Betrayal is something else. I feel continuing loyalty to the president's agenda, and I continue to respect the extraordinary political gifts and commitment that he's brought into the public
If
arena.
he has such great political gifts, how come he's always in a ditch? Everybody goes around saying he's such a wonderful politician, he's such a wonderful politician. The man hasn't been out of scandal land for 20 years.
Look, he has extraordinary powers, not only of recovery, but also of advocacy in the public realm, and those powers have to be balanced against flaws which I think rise to the height of almost tragic flaws.
Okay, what do you think of the scandal?
Well, it seems to me that the scandal presents us pretty squarely with a question most Americans don't want to be presented with and don't want to have to decide, and that is whether or not lying under oath, perjury, encouraging others to lie under oath in the United States District Court is consistent with the president's constitutional responsibility to take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
What is your judgment? Would you vote to impeach if you were a congressman?
I think the answer to the question I gave, I have been seeking people to tell me that one is consistent with the other. I've been seeking an argument, not even necessarily an argument I'd agree with, but an argument that can be rationally stated why perjury is consistent with taking care that the laws be faithfully executed. And I think that if you can't find a yes argument, I think that moves you very strongly towards an impeachment and removal.
Okay. I hear now in this sort of resignation, impeachment, no, let him hang on debate, people saying, well, can he govern? You know, oh, he couldn't, if he stays on, he couldn't govern. He wouldn't get anything done. And then my own view, I must say, is that should Clinton stay on, he is still the President of the United States, whose duties are carefully defined by the Constitution of the United States. He has the equivalent of 16 Senate votes in his veto power and an equivalent number in the House. He can drop bombs on the Sudan and on Afghanistan without anybody saying nay. He remains a very powerful man, and both he and the Republicans will have enormous motivation, even if he's, quotes, crippled, to get things done. Clinton to demonstrate that he's not crippled, and the Republicans to say they are not thwarting progress in the Republic just to get Clinton. True or false?
The president's ability to deal with Congress and to achieve results that require some degree of going forward rather than just signing the veto letter, I think is never entirely strong, is much weaker now. Example, Social Security partial privatization. I think this is something the country is ready for, the voters are ready for, the economy is ready for, members of both parties are ready for it. Senator Moynihan spoke out on the day before St. Patrick's Day this year on just that subject. Senator Bob Kerrey. The president has shown in hearings this year rather a great interest, but I don't think it's likely to go forward. The Republicans are not going to move if they think Clinton is going to pull the rug out from under them. They don't trust him. And so I think that you'll have a much harder time doing that than if you had a president whose word is trusted on Capitol Hill. Members of Congress of both parties kind of trade stories about when they found out that Bill Clinton's word was no good and when you couldn't trust him.
Yeah, but Bill, wouldn't Clinton be highly motivated? I mean, I happen to think most people in public life want to do what's best for the country, but let's get down and dirty. Beyond that, wouldn't it be in Clinton's best interest to get that enormous feather in his cap to reform Social Security? And if he has to say it in writing to the Congress, if you do X, Y, Z, because you don't trust me, I'll do A, B, C. I mean, wouldn't that be, you've worked with the Congress on some very important bills, isn't it?
The answer to that question is yes, but. If the president finds himself in a position early in 1999 where he can't allow a lot of daylight to open up between his own position and the preferences of House Democrats, who are the first line of political defense, that will complicate the task of opening up a political space for an appropriately broad discussion of Social Security and other matters. That's the first point. The second point is a structural point. Since we limited the president to 2 terms, years 7 and 8 are typically years in which it's harder to get something done. The third point is, and we don't know yet, the balance of power in the Congress may shift significantly as the result of the November elections, in part as the result of the events that we're now discussing. If that's the case, then one has to ask what the motivations of the Republicans in Congress will be. It takes 2 to govern. And the president in 1995 and early 96...
Right. I mean, what you're saying, it would depend on the motivations of the Republicans and the left wing of the Democratic Party, because each of them could stymie the president.
That's correct.
Right.
And each of those groups may have a strong motivation to do so. We've seen that in recent years in this presidency. And so I think it's going to be extremely complicated. The president may well be driven to greater activism in the sphere of foreign policy, where he's already demonstrated in the face of a sea of political troubles that when he acts boldly in pursuit of goals and objectives that Americans broadly support, that he will command the support of the Congress and everybody else who's relevant.
Ben, could I say a little more on foreign policy?
Please.
Because I think that's an area where the legacy of the Clinton administration as we speak is sort of on a tipping point. Bill Galston pointed out earlier that the Clinton administration moved on the NAFTA treaty, which was initiated by George Bush, and got it through the Congress. It was not by no means inevitable that a president of either party would have or tried to do that or would have succeeded. I think Bush probably would have succeeded, but in any case, that's a significant NATO expansion he quite rightly points to as a significant foreign policy. I think the problem here is that this is a president whose attention and engagement on foreign policy have always been limited. He does best on issues like that or on the Bosnia thing where he subcontracts it to a strong person, Madeleine Albright, NATO expansion, Richard Holbrooke on the Bosnia thing and so forth. Now we're seeing some of the earlier policies of the Clinton administration kind of unraveling. The UNSCOM inspection regime in Iraq, the agreement in 1994 with North Korea to supply them with certain supplies in return for which they said they weren't going to go ahead with nuclear missiles, or nuclear weapons buildup. Those issues are those agreements that the administration made, for which reasonable arguments could be made at the time, nonetheless seem to be unraveling. I think they need the sustained, those issues cannot be immediately solved. The United States is in a weak position in both of those areas, partly for reasons of the Clinton administration, but partly for reasons totally outside of Bill Clinton and his administration.
Michael,
you need sustained attention. Okay. Not clear we're going to get it.
Here is our final question. The late Claire Booth Luce had a wonderful line, which was that every president is remembered by a single sentence, and that's all. Everything seemed so important at the time, but George Washington, he was the father of our country. Abraham Lincoln, he freed the slaves. Franklin Roosevelt, even she gave 2 sentences to. He fought the Depression, he won World War II. Let us stipulate for the moment that Clinton serves out his 2 years. What is Bill Clinton's 1 sentence?
He was an articulate man who found himself in trouble he couldn't talk his way out of.
What is Bill Clinton's 1 sentence?
He helped lead the transition from a Cold War government to a post-Cold War world.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bill Galston, Michael Barone. I haven't thought of my own sentence yet, but I will. And thank you. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.